Okay, it's a few minutes past the hour now, and we'll get started on our training around analytic app development. So welcome to today's course, Analytic App Development for Intermediate Users. My name is Joe Miller, and I'm the Learning Strategy Manager here at Alteryx. Today we hope to give those who might be making their first foray into analytic apps a chance to learn how to do that, and then maybe if you have been in apps, maybe a few different tools or different interface tools you can use that you might not be using out of your arsenal today. Just a housekeeping item before we get any further into the presentation here. I will be managing the Q&A. That by default, all users that have entered onto this call here today are muted, so I will not be able to hear you over the line. If you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the Q&A, and I'll try to answer them either in the presentation, or if I miss it during the presentation, then I'll try to follow up at the end. So for today's training, we're going to be covering some of the upcoming trainings that we'll be offering in the next few months, some workflow background before we build our app, and then jump into the actual designer and try to build this app for ourselves. And then finally, at the end, I'll wrap up with a few other support items. So some of the upcoming trainings that we do have is in November, we do have 2 more trainings. The first one, starting next week, is going to be an introduction to Experian Consumer View data inside Alteryx. So if you'd like to learn more about householding matching or accessing your Mosaic data, we recommend that you join that one. And then finally, the last training of the month is going to be around data investigation. This piece is often overlooked when we see people using the designer. So being able to become more familiar with your data, what your data looks like, and where your data needs to be at, this would be a great training for you to attend. In December, we're going to be wrapping up our third-party series by teaching you about Experian Demographic, Mosaic, and Simmons third-party data. And then in the rest of the month, we'll be covering fuzzy matching, forecasting, and then finally, to end the year, some tips and tricks, Alteryx's most underrated tools. So some tools that you might be taking the long way around today, and these might serve as shortcuts or something you may not have thought of. If you ever want to access any of these virtual trainings, go to www.alteryx.com/virtual-training. There you can sign up for these upcoming trainings. And then if you want to look at anything that we've presented in the past, you can go ahead and click on Watch a Past Session and see the playbacks of these sessions that we have here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. And then also download the data to accompany those so you can build along with the playback. If anything today, if you exit out of this application development for intermediate users, and you have any more questions or you ran into some hiccups throughout your follow-along, feel free to go onto our community. At community, you can find like-minded peers that are asking questions that you are. You can create the valuable connections with those peers, ask a question, get an answer. You can upload a workflow that might be giving you trouble, or you might want to designate saying, I have this issue, and I'd like to see my data look like this. You can go ahead and upload that data and see your peers go to work. They could be just passing through. They could be the ACEs, the Alteryx experts, or they could be even Alteryx employees responding to them. So please go to the community to find out more. And then finally, another great area of the community is if you have an idea of where the product should go, you can go onto our ideas page and make suggestions or vote up other ideas. To find the community, you can go to community.alteryx.com and sign up. It should only take a few minutes, but the wealth of information there makes it well worth it. So before we get into our training, let's lay the land and see where we need to be. So what I've shown you on the right-hand side of this screen here is an application interface. This application is seeking to do a number of different things. We want to select a file, choose a field to sort on, select a number of records to sample, and choose an output location and type. Now you might be asking me right off the bat, why would I even think of an application? Have you ever gotten into a spot where you've been developing in Designer and you have to keep going back and changing your workflow every time you get a request. So say, for example, you do a report by state, and you run a report for the state of Ohio. What if someone comes back and says, now give me Michigan? You might change your workflow, run it again. Now give me Washington, right? And you go in and keep changing the parameters of that workflow over and over again. This could be for your own self-interest. This could be for somebody else's interest. But you find that, I don't really like going in and changing and redeveloping my workflow every time. I'd rather parameterize my workflow so that I can just plug in the values that I want at certain areas that I know I'll be changing throughout my development here. And my workflow will be flexible to those changes that I want. So all the analytical application is doing is allowing you to parameterize your workflow, and you, the developer, designate where those parameterized pieces go. So what parts would you like to be flexible and what would you not like to be flexible? Additionally, even if it's something that you don't want to do repetitively, let's say you wanted to share a workflow with your boss, right? We offer the Alteryx Analytic Gallery, which serves as an interface for people to interact with your workflow without ever having the Alteryx designer. This would be a great use case for the app because you could just create an interface prompt that you could show your boss and say, hey, pick a state. Pick the top stores inside your state. You can parameterize it so the boss never has to go in and sees what's underlaying it inside the workflow. They just can go ahead and plug in their own values and kick out a report that's relevant to them. So that's the real value add that the analytic apps have. In this case, we're looking for an analytical app that gives the top stores based on total sales. Here's the caveat, though. My organization gives me lots of files, right? I have 4 different files for Colorado. I have Colorado South, Colorado North, Colorado East, Colorado West. And I could have multiple files across different states as well. I need to let my user essentially say what file would he like to choose to report on. So if he's looking for top stores in Colorado West, I'll allow that user to connect to that file and then do any sort of logic on it. In this case, we're allowing someone to connect to our file and then choosing essentially the top field to sort on, okay? And essentially what this is asking for, do you want top 10 stores by sales, top 10 stores by customer visits, top 10 by credit? This is what we're really selecting. So based on the file that I've connected, I should see the fields that that file has. So would I like to see the sales field or the credit field or the number of customers? I would select it here, and then do I want the top 10? Do I want the top 5? Do I want the top 20? I can enter those parameters here. And then finally, if I would like to save it off somewhere for my own use, I want to allow to give that option to the user. So this is what I'm looking to do with my application here today. In order to achieve this, we're going to be learning about a few different interface tools. We'll be learning about the File Browse tool, the Drop-Down tool, the Action tool, the Error Message tool, and the Numeric Up and Down. You can find these tools all within the Interface tab of your designer. If you do not see the Interface Designer tab in your designer at this moment, it's because we've actually hidden it until you've actually found a purpose to need it. So if you go over here to the top of your tool palette, you will find a plus sign where it will allow you to select what categories you expose. So if you don't see interface there, go ahead and click on that plus sign and search through the categories that you'd like to expose, check it, and then it will show up within your tool palette. Also, if I mention a tool throughout this training and you might not know where it is, you can always search that tool over here in the search bar. Okay, let's jump into the File Browse. Now, when I talk about analytic app development, I think it's good to specify both sides. And when I say both sides, I'm going to specify that in a minute, but both sides of what you want out of your workflow. Okay? So one side, when I talk about it, is your flat workflow. You've built a workflow today, and this is the workflow that you're plugging in new parameters in. The other one is, what do I want my interface to look like to my designers or to the people that are making decisions? What do I want them to be able to change within this workflow? In this case, I've identified 4 pieces. I want them to be able to choose the file that they connect to, one they want a place that they can save out, and then a field to sort on and a number of fields to, or a number of records to return as a resulting data set. When building an analytic app, I always recommend that people kind of designate what they'd like inside this interface. This way, it'll help them figure out the way that they'd like their interface to connect into their workflow and join and parameterize it. So always go through and specify what you want your user to be able to do to your workflow, and then we can start building it out. In this case, selecting a file, and then also selecting a place to save that file. Now, if you've already been using the designer today, the behavior of this is really familiar. It's just like using an input data tool where you could select this drop down. You could select a file to connect to, or ODBC or OLEDB. There are many different ways that you can connect, but also you can actually control what files they are allowed to select. So if you're doing something inside your workflow that's only good for this sort of delimited file, maybe you want to specify that. Maybe you want to specify that it's CSV only to make sure that they only see CSV files. If you specify what files they're allowed to look at, when they go in and open their file browser, only those file types will show in each folder. So it's a nice way of making it a little bit more navigable, even in the Explorer, for them to choose the file. You can specify these files by using either question marks or asterisks. An asterisk represents a whole length of a string, and it can vary. In this case, I can say, this whole file name can be any name, but it has to end with .csv. That's my rule. If I wanted to control, let's say, the naming convention of the file, and I wanted to make sure that every file started with Colorado and ended with .csv, I could just write in here Colorado asterisks .csv, and it would only show those files that fit that format. Now in this case, we've created an OR statement. Okay, so what you're seeing here in this bullet point is the choice to choose between 2 different file types. We could choose between a CSV or a DBF, and the user has specified that it can be any string leading up to it, so any name, just with those extensions. And this pipe here is denoting that it can be really either or. They can select either or of those files. Okay, and that can be used on the input or output. So maybe you could enforce saying, hey, we'll only let you save the CSV on this output. There's a way to enforce that. The next one that we're going to select from is the drop-down. The drop-down interface is a great interface to list values for a user to select from, and a great way to enforce one and only one selection. So if you're ever looking for a user to be able to only select one thing, always look to the drop-down. It's a really good one. You can choose how to display the values inside this drop-down. So I could actually write in the values that I want to partake inside this drop-down. I could push the data in from a different tool, which we'll be doing today. We'll be bringing it in from a file. We could bring it from an optional input, and then also we could choose by data type what fields we'd like to expose. The final interface element that we'd want is a numeric up and down, and this, we're probably all familiar with this behavior, but I could toggle up and down the numbers that I want to expose. I'm going to show how you can arrange that in a different way. So I could actually orient this so it's showing decimals, or I could put a limit that it should never exceed 100. I can actually control how this numeric up and down happens, but always use this when you're wanting to pass some sort of numeric value. But within that, you can choose the min and max, how it increments. So do I want this to increment by 5 every time I press the up and down arrow? What do I want the default value to be when I first bring up the interface? Do I want it to be 5, 10, or 15? And then the amount of decimal places to show after the fact. Next is the error message. So if you ever want to go in and control what your users are doing or ensure the quality of how they're interacting with your interface, you can actually put in error messaging. So for example, in this workflow, I always want to make sure that they choose a field to sort on. I can drop a tool inside my canvas that basically says, hey, if you haven't filled out this field, we won't allow you to run the application. And you can create a lot more complex logic on when to trigger this error, but it's going to be very simple in this case today. We're going to go in and go into essentially a formula editor for our error expression and say when that condition is true, display X message. And we can specify what we want to read out in this window here. And then finally is the action tool. And this is really where we find a lot of users having difficulty, but it's also one of the biggest and most important tools when we talk about analytical applications. So all these tools that I've been talking about before, like the numeric up and down, the drop down, the file browse, these are all elements that the user interacts with. These are the places where they put their values that they want to land inside your workflow. The action tool is what actually puts those values into your workflow. The action somehow creates a connection between what happens in that interface and your workflow and translates it. So what tool, when they go ahead and select the file that they choose up at that file browse, what tool should that flow into? Which input tool, right? It could be many different tools. So the action really is that literal specifier that sits between that customer-facing or the outward-facing layer into your workflow and says how it should be translated for your workflow. And then we'll go in and you'll see that there's a few different anchor options when you bring in action tool. You'll get a queue, this little diamond here, and then a lightning bolt. The queue essentially basically says it'll accept questions. That's what the queue stands for, is questions from interface tools. And a question is really nothing more than a variable passed by an interface tool. This diamond says it can only come from the conditional tool. The conditional tool we will not be talking about today, but you could create some sort of logic based on what's put into the interface. So for example, I could say, hey, if someone chose Michigan, go and display these sort of interface tools or do this to the workflow, right? With it today, we're not going to cover that. That can be a little bit more complex. We're just going to be covering questions and then a lightning bolt. And the lightning bolt is really where it connects into our workflow and where we want that action to happen at. So now we're ready for the Alteryx Designer training. So let's first go ahead and build very quickly a workflow that really represents what my process looks like today. So I'm going to go in and drag into my canvas and input data tool. I'm going to browse for it, and it's my master store file from Colorado. Okay, and I mentioned I could have a store file from Ohio, from Massachusetts, from New York. It could be anything, and this is really what I want people to be able to change without me updating every time. So that's my first one, and the process that I have today is that I'm looking to sort on this file, and I'm looking at sales descending. So we'll say total sales descending, and my sample tool is only looking at the first 10 of these. So I'm going to quickly run that. You can see I have 42 records coming out of my file here, 42 different stores. I order them based on total sales, who has the most total sales to the least. And then I'm saying, hey, I only want to look at the first 10. Pretty straightforward. And now I might be running it out to a certain location. I'm going to put it, I'll just write a new one here. I'm going to create this for demo, and I'm going to save it as a YXDB. So we'll save. And there's this process I have running over and over. And people might be coming to me saying, hey, you should connect to this file and run it for the top 10 sales. Or we like master store file of Colorado, but we want to know by total customers. Or we only want the top 5 customers, right? So there's many different ways that they might want to orient my workflow. So let's create a way for it to be parameterized. So I'm going to zoom down a little bit and bring in my workflow. When I develop in applications, think of applications as development vertically versus horizontally. And this certainly depends on how you've built your workflow today, but I'm setting this based on the default of how the designer would come in if you downloaded 10.5, right? Your horizontal workflow would be running left to right, But when we talk about interface tools, we usually build them in a way that's vertical, so we can see which tools that they're plugging into. So going back to my use case, see if I can bring over a window here. Hold on one second. Okay. So based on my use case, I really want to first parameterize what they select for their input file. So let's go over to our interface tool and look for that file to browse. As always, if you ever have any questions about these tools beyond what I've talked about today, go ahead and drag that onto the canvas, and you'll notice that if I press F1, I'm going to get a pop-up window of the Alteryx help. And this is a great way of figuring out how you configure it beyond what we may just be talking about today. So always hit F1 on the highlighted tool if you ever want to find out more. Now let's create a way to make this interact. And notice that my workflow now looks a little different too. Let me back up here so we can see this happen again. All right, go back to my workflow. So you'll notice my workflow looked like this before. Notice how none of them have actually any icons at the top. Watch what happens to my whole workflow when I drag that file browse in. You'll see that I get little lightning bolts on the top of each workflow. All these lightning bolts are saying, hey, I'm available for parameterizing. Connect me in if you want me to be parameterized. Also, when these are showing, it's basically saying that Alteryx has now detected that you're changing the file type. By default, your workflow is being saved as a YXMD. It's always being saved as that process. As soon as we've drug in this new interface tool, we're changing how that type appears. So if I were to go click on my white space and go over to workflow, you'll see that I have this analytic app toggle now available. So it's not a standard workflow because I have an interface. It's now an analytical app. Alteryx was smart enough to detect this is where I was going. Okay, and this will be saved as a different file type. So now I've got my interface, and you'll notice that there's one more change that I'm going to point out, is at this top left, right by the Run button, we have this little wand. And if I highlight over it, it says Run as an analytical app. I'm going to select that, and it's popping up on my other window here. But I'm going to drag it over onto this designer page here and show you what that looks like. So now we have this element facing us that's saying, basically, how do we want a file browse? I could go to this drop-down and say, do I want a database connection, HDFS, do I want a file browse? And you'll see that I have a way to look through my data. However, I haven't really told this interface what it should change inside my workflow. You'll see that it's kind of sitting on its own, and it doesn't know if I should be changing where I output or what I input. So let's go ahead and first specify what it should be changing. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit here and drag this onto the canvas. I'm going to drag that queue down to my lightning bolt. So I'm saying the variable from right here, whatever file we choose or whatever database connection we do, change the input data tool to reflect that. Okay. Now when I drew that string between the two, it says, okay, I understand what you want, but we need to make that relationship between the two. How do you want me to change the input data tool? There's actually a couple different ways that you could be changing it. So you'll see in this action tool, if I do select it, there's a drop down saying, do you just want to update the data tool, period? Or do you want to update the raw XML? Not in this case. Do you want to update a specific value? Like maybe I just want to change the directory of that tool or the password, right? I could actually change that using just a portion of what's in that input data tool. In this case, I just want to input or change the whole input to reflect whatever's inside that file browse. Okay. Now if I click on my little wand again, you will see that I've got the same interface, but now I know in the background it's connected to my workflow, which makes me happy. However, this file browse (7) is not really a great way to prompt my users to use the analytical app in a correct application. So what I'm going to do here is go ahead and configure my interface tool to reflect what I want. So I'm going to click out of this and go over to my file browse tool. And choose what I want to display within that analytical app interface. So in this case, I'll say, please select your input file. Great. I can choose if I want this to be a save as dialog, which is a kind of a spoiler alert for what we're going to be doing for this output tool. In this case, we're just looking to read in, so I don't need to select that. Do I just want to give standard database file formats? Am I looking to do report formats? Or do I want to specify exactly what files do I want to come in? So in this case, if I were to select this, it would be exposing *.text, so any text files, or all files. So it's showing that anything can precede that period and any extension at the end. Really could be any string. In this case, I'm fine with all files. I'm just going to leave it in standard database formats, and we'll be good to go. So now when I go ahead and select on my wand again, you'll see that I have please select your input file, and they could go in and browse through what they want. Great. So the next thing that we want to do is go ahead and select what they want to sort on. Currently I'm sorting on sales, but what if they want to do credit or customer or even county, right? We could actually say what they're allowed to sort on. So let me go ahead and say that what we're going to sort on is really going to depend on what file we're connecting to. In this case, we never have to worry about it because total sales is always in master store file of Colorado. What happens if I choose master store file of Massachusetts and it's not called total sales? What if it's just called sales? What if it's just, a different name than what we'd expect? We can actually map in what field names are within this file and allow our user to select it. Notice that we do allow people to select one field in order to descend. So what tool did we mention earlier that might be helpful for that? Drop down. So I'm going to drag my drop down onto the canvas, and I'm going to say, I'm going to configure this interface to say, select a field to sort on. Okay. So here we go. But still, this tool really doesn't have any sort of connection. It doesn't know where to go into my workflow yet, and it doesn't know what fields are available from our file. Well, in order to get your workflow to figure it out, it's quite easy. You can drag it from this output queue connector into your dropdown and say, hey, any fields inside this whatever file or database they select, map them into this dropdown tool and display those. So inside this drop-down configuration, you see it's changed a little bit. I have this text on how I want to prompt my user, but also you'll see that I have the ability to show what fields based on types. So I could show only string fields or only numeric fields or only date fields, only spatial object fields for people to select. In this case, since I'm always going to be sorting, I'm always going to be sorting on something numeric. That might be a business rule that I have. So I'm going to go through all here and choose what fields I've identified as numeric. So I'm just going to deselect all right off the bat and just say, give me double, float, and everything like that. There we go. So now only display the fields that are numeric, and now we need to connect it into my sort tool and allow the sort tool to be updated. So I'm going to make a little bit more room here. Okay, so this action tool looks a little bit different. All right, and we're looking to update only a portion of our configuration here. If you look inside the sort tool, you can see that we have a name, we have a field called total sales, an order descending. That's all we really have as part of this configuration. And what I need to do is update a value inside this tool. What I really want to update is what name we are going to be plugging in as part of our parameterization. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and expand everything that's inside this field list to update and say, what do I want to update with the value coming from this drop down? So let's say my new field is just called sales. and not total sales. What would I want it to update? Well, I'd want it to update the value of total sales. I'd want it to completely replace that and just say sales descending. So I'm just going to highlight that, and that's all I need to do for the action tool. What I see a lot of people get stuck on is they think that they need to do something more, but just highlighting it is the selection of how you want the action tool to update your workflow. So there we go. So now I would expect if they were to choose sales from this new file, it's going to replace total sales, and it's still going to make it descending. If I wanted it to change ascending, right? If I want it to be ascending order or descending order, I just could drop in another action tool, right? Map it in and say, hey, update that ascending or descending value. And I might create another selection from this. I could actually update those. So you can map in many different ways of changing your tool, and that's the purpose of this exercise. But I just want to show one for now. So there we go. I've got my input tool parameterized, my sort tool, and now I want to allow people to select the total number of how many rows they want inside their workflow. So that right now it's top 10, but maybe I want to make it top 5. The tool to allow people to kind of toggle through numeric values, that works really well, again, as I mentioned, numeric up and down. So I'm going to drag that onto my canvas, and I'm going to tell that how to map into my sample tool here. Let's do a quick look at how this looks at the interface so far. Okay, so now you see I've got my input file, a field to sort on. Now you'll notice the field to sort on is empty because without choosing a file, I don't have any fields that I can read from that file. So this will populate as soon as I have a file selected, and then numeric up and down. So by default, it's showing 50, and it's incrementing by 1. So I'm going to cancel out of there and make this connection here. So I'm going to say numeric up and down should connect to my sample tool. And now I have to choose what I want to change inside my sample tool. So again, I'll go to my action tool. I can expand all just to look at what I think is appropriate. And I'm going to say, well, currently I have the first 10 selected, right? My end value is equal to 10. So I'm going to go into my action tool and say the end value of 10 should be replaced with whatever number is coming from above. And that will dynamically change my sample tool. Now let's clean up how this numeric up and down will look to our users. By default, I might create something that's a better prompt for our users. So I'll say, select the number of records to sample. And then I can control how that numeric up and down toggles. So for me, I think it's kind of useless to ever create a query where they want the top 0 records. Maybe I always want to implement a minimum. So I'm going to say top 1 records. I'm fine with a maximum of 100. And incrementing by 1, we saw that was the behavior before. It was counting 51, 52, 53. So I'm going to leave it as 1 because we can't have a fraction of a record returned. And then by default, I always want to show the top 10. And then down here, I could specify the number of decimal places that I want to display. But since we're always working with whole numbers in this case, I'm just going to leave it as is. So let's go ahead and go to my analytic app wand here again. We'll look at it. And you can see by default, 10 is showing. I can see the select number of records. I can see it up and down. Seems to be working well. Great. So finally, I've got one more thing to do. I have to allow my users some place to write out this information. So I'm going to go ahead and use the same tool that we've looked at before, this file browse, and allow them to display a save as dialog for them to save out to a specific location. So my file browse is in. Let's quick write something in that allows them to be prompted correctly. So I'll say browse to where you'd like to save your file. And in this case, if you're working with an output tool, what we'd want to look at is making this a save as dialog. So where do you want to save it? Pretty straightforward. You'll always hit this if you're looking at the output. So let's map that into our output data tool here. and you can say update output data tool. We're just updating the whole path. We're happy with that. Everything's great. So let's go ahead and try running this application for the first time. Now, I will make a specific call out is that some people get confused around running an analytical app versus a workflow. So let me demonstrate real quick the difference between this play button and this analytical app. When I select this play button, I am only going to be running my workflow, aka the same parameters that I have every time. It's always going to run for Colorado, sales descending, first 10, and always output to demo YXDB. It is the non-parameterized version of your workflow. If I want to run the parameterized version of my workflow and test the application, I can go ahead and select my Run as Application, and then I get my interface here. So let's go ahead and try configuring this for the first time. I'm going to go to File, Browse. I'm going to look for my data here. There's my master store, Colorado. Now you'll see that the fields that I have available are total sales, credit sales, total customers, lat and long. Why did this not display everything? The answer is because we only allowed numeric values to be displayed here. So if I were to cancel out and by default change it to everything, you'd see I'd have cities and states and addresses. But in this case, I've only said I only want to work with numeric fields. So I'm going to say total customers. We want total customers to be at the top. And we'll look at the top 5. And let's choose a place to save. So I'm going to go File, Browse. And I'm going to save it out to an output. And I'll save it as a YXDB. We can change it to something else because I have all file types. I'll save it to a CSV, and I'll call this demo. OK. So I've plugged in all my parameters that are going to essentially represent each interface tool here. And now as soon as I click Finish, I'm going to plug these into my workflow, and they will execute. So my workflow has run with the new parameters, and you'll see it's going to prompt you to say, hey, do you want to open this output file to view what happened? Let's select OK. I'll bring in my CSV, and you'll see that I've got my top 5 based on customers. Great. So that would be the difference between configuring them 2 different ways. Now let me show you a few more things that might be helpful inside your development. If you go to View Interface Designer, I may have done that too quick, so I'm going to do this again. View Interface Designer. It'll allow you to further kind of orient how you want this to be laid out. Okay, so by default, we just coincidentally happened to drop these tools in a way on our canvas. They all fell into a good order. But what if I want to kind of reorder how these are displayed? I could go in and highlight the portion that I'd want to move around and use these up and down arrows to justify where I want them in my canvas or on my screen here. So I could orient that. Maybe I want my input and output the same area. I could certainly do that. So I can totally add whatever I want. And notice that I could also add certain elements to it. So maybe I want to create some sort of group box. So I've got a group right here, and maybe I want to group both of my file browsers inside the same thing. So I'll move my group box up, and you'll see that it is up here. But I'm going to move each of these 2 elements inside the group box. So now you can see I've got my label group, and there's a little bit of a border around them, so it's logically putting them together. Okay. I'm also going to select my label group here, and I can rename it. Looking over on this configuration over here, I'm going to say this is my I/O for my workflow. There we go. Other things that I could add are links and tabs. So if I wanted multiple tabs for people to go through, I could create labels within the workflow. So I could put that above maybe these 2. Just like that. Right? I could say it's sort of a rank function, so we'll call this ranking. There you go. So now we know that these 2 are kind of basically ranking our customers or our total sales. So there are ways to kind of configure that interface. So what do you want to happen when you're done? Okay, you could do a couple of things that we're not going to talk about in this training today, but I just wanted to empower you to know in your future development. So you could go ahead and say some custom output message when you were done. If your app was successful, you could actually trigger another analytic app, which is a great way to do waterfall processes. On success, do you want to show the results to the user or not? So that prompt window asking us to open the output data was available at the end. So those are some of the things that you can configure. The final thing that I'm going to show to you that is a must, it's an absolute must when testing your applications, is this little, what we call the test view. It's really noted by this plus and minus with the wand right here. So let's go ahead, and I'm just going to connect very quickly to show you what that looks like. So I'm going to do the same configuration. I'm going to output to CSV. I'm going to change this value to 5. And sort on total sales. Okay. Once I've been able to enter these in for my test view, let's open debug. This is a great way to see if your parameters are actually passing into your workflow. So let's go ahead and open debug. Okay. And I'm going to look into my canvas here. Perfect. Okay. So what you have up here is basically all the values that got passed in. You see while browse, we chose this location, output, numeric up and down 5, and drop down of total sales. But where the really easy value, or a little bit easier to understand, is to see if your values actually landed within this workflow. So let's go through them one by one. We can see that we did get that parameter passed in. It's still total sales, so we're happy with that. We can see that my value has changed to 5 in this debug mode, and then I have a demo.csv. Let's open it one more time and change them a little bit more. So I'm going to go back into my debug mode right here, and I'll change this to 3. I'll choose credit sales and change it to a new location. We'll just call it demo 2. We'll open debug again. Okay. So now we can see that I have that same input. My total sales is descending. See, this is going to be a big problem because we chose total credit. So we're going to have to fix that because of our debug mode. You can see that the 3 did get picked up properly, and my demo 2 made it into the output tool. So let's see if we can find anything very quickly to see if something is kind of messing with our total sales. Go back to my workflow. We know something must be happening with this update field list. So let's go in, ensure that it's total sales. Okay. Perfect. Let's try debugging one more time. I'm going to close my old debuggers here. View Interface Designer. Go to debug mode. The nice thing is it does persist, so let's try it again with credit sales and see if that worked. So you can still see that it is total sales. Let's try one more fix here, see if we can fix it. All right. Go to Interface Designer one more time. Go to my test mode. Credit sales, open debug. Credit sales, so it now is replacing, so it was a correct fix. So you can see how that debug mode is exceptional because you don't have to sort out what might be happening vertically and horizontally. You can see what's happening inside of here, when it started running, what expected if there's any errors that came out of it. This is a great resource for you. So that's an example of our simple application. Although it was simple, we do have a lot of tools in here that may get you on your way with more advanced macro development. And certainly if you were in application development, maybe I've shown you some things in that interface designer that will cause you to kind of dig a little deeper into it. So let's close out with some of the support details that we have here at Alteryx. Again, community.alteryx.com. I can't speak highly enough of it. That's a great way to get your answers and get your answers quite quickly. Also, if you want to learn more, we do have some other application trainings that are available on alteryx.com/product training. Go ahead and click on that virtual training tab and you can watch some playbacks there. And then finally, if there's something that the community can't seem to respond to and it's a very minutiae, almost like a bug, maybe contact support at alteryx.com to get your questions answered there, or hit the live chat at alteryx.com/support. And finally, you can give them a call at 1-888-255-1207. After this course today, you will be redirected to a survey. This survey is a great way for us to kind of figure out what courses that we want to run in the upcoming future. So if you could fill out some of your interests there, it would greatly help us. And then also give the feedback on how effective this training was for you and what ways we might be able to improve it. Thank you for joining today. I'm going to hang around for a few more minutes and try to answer any Q&A if there are any. So if not, thank you for joining, and I appreciate your time.